It may only be $2 to pony up, but it took over $15 million and 27 years to bring this 1922 carousel from Youngstown, Ohio to a clear pavilion here in Brooklyn Bridge Park. Today we're meeting up with Jane Walentas, the woman behind Jane's Carousel. So people might be surprised to hear that Jane's Carousel is a project that has been in the works since the 1980s.
Yeah.
So let's go back 30 years. Why were you in the market for a carousel?
My husband was supposed to develop this park back then in the 80s, actually started in the late 70s. And he had a master planner named Ben Thompson, who was a very well-known architect and planner. And it was very desolate down here. There wasn't a park. It was barely a park. And it wasn't zoned residential here yet. There was no one here. So the idea was the piece of property was owned by the state, and David was supposed to turn it into a park. And Ben Thompson said, the first thing you should do is have a carousel, because that will draw people to the river and what will become the park. So I was given the task of finding the carousel. I was an art director at Estee Lauder at the time, and I liked carousels and I knew about them. So I looked all over the country as carousels came up at auction and was looking for one to buy. And then we found this one.
So how does one go about acquiring a carousel, and what went into selecting this particular carousel?
Good question. Carousels come up at auction. Amusement parks were going out of business. It was not so much now, maybe, because a lot of amusement parks are gone now, but then a lot of parks were being sold and all the pieces from the park were being auctioned off. So there was a magazine, it was the magazine of the National Carousel Association, and they would advertise when there was an auction. So I looked all over the country. I went to Florida to a carousel that was a park that was closing. I went to New Orleans, New Jersey, and then this one, my husband came with me when we went to the auction for this. And I said, wow, if we're really serious, this is, after having looked at about 6 carousels, which I wasn't that crazy for, this one was perfect. It was all intact. It was all original from 1922. The horses were all from then. Sometimes they got broken up, or there'd be a fire and they'd get, pieces would be lost. But this carousel was all original. It was made as a very elaborate, beautiful carousel. You can see the rounding boards are very fancy. It was just, a first-class carousel, vintage 1922. The neighborhood had a lot of history, and we wanted something with a lot of history to it. It was perfect.
So being that this carousel was originally built in 1922 and even survived a fire, what condition was it in when you bought it?
It was in good condition. A few of the horses were singed. The paint was singed, but no wood was actually burnt. And the chariot over there was, just the paint was singed off. So it survived the fire very beautifully. The firemen really saved the carousel because the cyclone behind it is what burned. So they kept, hosing this down for, I don't know, maybe 2 days even. So it was in good shape. It had 10 to 12 coats of park paint on it that I had to scrape off. But it ran. We did a lot of upgrade to the motor and everything. But we could have moved it here and opened it the way it was. It just didn't look so great.
So you touched on it a little bit, but the restoration process was not a small undertaking. So
no,
walk
us
us
through
crazy.
Yeah,
walk us through what it took to bring this back to life.
Well, my first goal and intention was to take it down to its original paint, the original paint from 1922, and I was going to scrape all the 10 coats of park paint off with an X-Acto knife. My plan was to just varnish that original paint and leave it in its original state from 1922. I spent years scraping that paint, and I realized pretty quickly, like within the first 2 years, the paint was too fragile and broken, and there were too many repairs underneath that needed to be made. Sloppy repairs have been done by the park, and to really do it right, I needed to repaint it. I couldn't leave it in that 1922 state. So that sort of broke my heart at first because that was the image I had of, this kind of old, fragile paint. But what I did was instead, I still scraped it down to the original paint, but I documented everything I found from 1922. So every color here is matched to the 1922 colors. And I also found, in scraping, it revealed all the beautiful carvings that were kind of buried under all that paint, so that was exciting. And then I did find remnants of design, like not just on the horses, but all these stencils I uncovered. They were painted over. And I uncovered all those stencils and made very careful drawings and photographs and documented every single thing I found. It was exciting, but it took a long time. And I worked alone, just alone with one carpenter for many, many years, because at first everybody thought I was crazy. What are you doing? I had a big, old, wonderful studio, but it was rough over here in Dumbo, and I lived in Manhattan. And I would come over every day and all by myself would just scrape the paint. I started with these other pieces, because I didn't want to ruin the horses, because I was a novice at this scraping thing. Almost like 25 years later, and I had a real crew helping me, I had a roadmap to what to do to now paint it and replace everything that had been, like all the jewels had been taken out to clean up, and the mirrors on the bridles. And so I had a complete documentation of everything, and then I had a crew of 6, and we did it all in 2 years.
Was there anyone special that you collaborated with to do the restoration?
After we first bought it, it was not my intention to restore it at all. Most people at that time, I didn't agree with the trends in the restoration of carousels. They were not scraping down to the original paint, but dipping and stripping them in chemicals to get all that paint off. And that's very bad for the horses. The joints get loose and it messes up the wood. And then they were spraying them with automobile paints, automobile enamels, so that they would be very durable, but they looked terrible. They had no soul, they had no style. They looked like
plastic.
Yeah, very plastic. So that's why I decided that I would get involved in the restoration after talking to people who were doing it that way, and I didn't agree. So I went to a Carousel convention. They have conventions every year down in North Carolina. So I met 2 people who I really thought were doing great work, who I had a lot of respect for, and the work that they were doing I thought was absolutely beautiful. I would have hired each of them, but they wanted me, one was from North Carolina and the other from Colorado, and they would have wanted me to pack up the Carousel on 2 18-wheelers and send it to them, and we didn't want to do that. So I hired one of them as a consultant, and he came and spent about a week with me here in Dumbo and helped me organize my studio and get the proper supplies, and just got me started. Every year or 2, I'd give him a call and check in about how things were going, and he'd give me some helpful tips. It was great. Will Morton is his name. Lovely fellow.
What about the murals? So you said you were able to scrape it down. Were they pretty preserved at that point?
The murals, luckily, were never painted over. So they are original to 1922. There are murals in there and on these rounding boards. That was very lucky. They were very dirty with filthy varnish, and I called the Met because I had never restored a painting like that. And they sent me someone, and he just cleaned all those paintings of their old varnish, and they looked great. So then they sat, covered up until the Carousel all went back together again. Yeah.
So when you spend decades restoring a vintage carousel, you can't put it inside just anything, and you can't trust just any architect to design its enclosure. So what went into the design of this pavilion?
Jean Nouvel is the architect. He is from France. His studio is in Paris. He's a world-class architect. He won the Pritzker Prize several years ago. He's done major buildings all over the world. We knew Jean. My husband had commissioned him to do a building for, at that time, back in the 80s, when he was going to do this park, there was going to be what was called a pier building pretty much under the Manhattan Bridge, and it was a mixed-use building, a hotel and movie theaters, and again, to bring people over here. So Jean designed that hotel, and we got to know him at that time. The building never got built for a lot of reasons, but I always was a big fan of Jean's, and he did beautiful glassy buildings that we had seen. So my idea was for a glassy building here, and Jean first didn't really have too much interest in designing a carousel building. First, he couldn't understand because in Paris, carousels are never in buildings. They're closed up in the winter, they're just opened in the summer, and he couldn't understand why we wanted it in a building. So that took some convincing. And also he does major buildings, and this little building didn't really thrill him at first, but he loved the site. He knew the site from the hotel that he had designed, and he absolutely loved it. So we imagined a round building, which is typical, and then he came up with a square building, and it's acrylic, it's not glass. At first, it was very disappointing. We said, Jean, a square carousel building, it's like impossible. What happened to round buildings? And he was adamant. He said, you'll see. Anyway, a lot of things happened, and it finally got approved as a square building, and today we feel so happy with it. You know, a round building I think would have been terrible. So he was the genius that he is for a reason. The acrylic was more difficult for us because there's deformation. You know, when you look at the bridge, it's deformed. Well, today, that's the charm of it, but at the time, we had trouble swallowing that idea. The reason he wanted acrylic, and this is 4 inches thick, these walls, is because he didn't want mullions, seams, basically.
Okay.
In glass, you would have had a seam that you would have really seen. He wanted there to be no seams at all and welded, but it would have taken 6 months just welding out here. It would have been a nightmare. Forget it. We put our foot down. But from a distance, this looks like there's no seam. It looks like a sheer, clear wall. So that's why he wanted the acrylic. It's something that's used in aquariums, in like shark tanks. The north and south facades, they open fully, so in the summer, it's like wide open, you know, like it is in Paris. Anyway, we think he was absolutely right. We love him to this day. He comes by every once in a while. It was a struggle at times with Jean, but you know, he is brilliant, and he gave us a brilliant building, really. So that had a happy ending.
Yeah. I mean, it's beautiful. It's one of the prettiest carousel enclosures I've ever seen.
Yeah, it is. It's great. We're so very happy with it.
So during Superstorm Sandy, this carousel was flooded with over 1.5 feet of water. I mean, it was a beautiful sight, but it had to be sort of heartbreaking to witness.
It was. Before the carousel opened, we had an earthquake in New York. So we stood up to that, and then it was very soon after that Hurricane Sandy came. It was scary and kind of heartbreaking, but it could all be fixed.
What was going through your mind as Sandy hit the park and your 27-year labor of love?
We live in an adjacent building, and I could watch the storm. It was, high tide was predicted at 8 o'clock that night, I think. And we stayed in. Our building was actually on lockdown. But I could see the building, and I could see the tide. At 5 o'clock, the water was up to this concrete deck. And I said to my husband, it's only 5 o'clock. High tide isn't really till 8 o'clock. I can't imagine. Well, sure enough, even before 8 o'clock, the waves were lapping at like 5 feet above the floor. All the lights in Manhattan, downtown Manhattan, were out. All the lights in Brooklyn were out, and these LEDs in this building, there's a perimeter of LED lights, somehow stayed on. And that's why it was a neighbor who got that shot that then went viral. And it looked like the carousel was floating. And then those lights went out eventually too, but it stayed lit for quite a while. It was pretty impressive. So I didn't know what to expect in the morning. And we came over here. The floor was full of mud that had, washed in, and the trash cans had been floating all over, but the carousel looked good, actually. It was clear that it had been wet, The platform took a little bit of a beating, but not really. This wood is over 100 years old, and it's, as one of our maintenance people said, this is when wood was really wood. I mean, this was underwater, like you said. It was under at least a foot of water. But it looked good, and we thought, it's fine. But then we have a 5-foot crawl space in our basement, and that's where all our heating system, our electronics, because Jean Nouvel, the wonderful Pritzker Prize winning architect, didn't want anything on the roof. Usually these things go on the roof, but he wanted a beautiful roof. So all of that is in the basement, in our 5-foot crawl space. So we opened the hatch, which is in the middle there, and it was full of water. 5 feet of water in that basement. So that was a little devastating. So everything was ruined, basically, except the carousel. And the carousel motor, which is up here at this level, is meant to get wet because it's often outside. So as soon as we pumped out that basement and dried it out, in a week we pushed the button and the carousel ran. So we were able to open, I think 2 weeks after the storm, we were open. It wasn't a fun winter because it was very cold. We got space heaters and we worked it out, you know, but we were open. It was amazing.
How long had the carousel been open before Sandy hit?
It was a year, I guess. We opened in September 2011, and my recollection is Sandy was 2012, I think. So.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you spent 27 years restoring it. You had it open for 1 year, and then it gets flooded.
Yeah, it was pretty painful.
Yeah.
A lot of tears. Until we knew that it was okay.
Now, the carousel has become sort of an icon here in Dumbo and is loved by a new generation of kids and adults alike. But do you ever get visitors that remember it from its previous home in Idora Park?
We get thousands of them. We've had busloads of people from Youngstown who still live in Youngstown, plus people whose grandparents were in Youngstown and now live in Brooklyn. There's so many visitors from Youngstown, and I still get emails from them all the time. But we have a guest book for we call them Youngstowners, I think that's what they call themselves, for them to, when they come, they sign and put notes in it, and then when others come, they look through and see their, you know, old high school friends or whoever, or we've been through 2 books already.
Wow.
2 like guest books, like you would have in a gallery. Thousands of people from Youngstown come here, and they're so nostalgic about it. It was so important. The park that it was in was a very beautiful, it wasn't an amusement park, it was like what we think of as maybe a county park. It had a lake and a ballroom, and it was so classic roaring 20s. And it was from a time when Youngstown was very prosperous. It was a prosperous steel town. So this was a symbol of their prosperity in a way. So people, you know, who got engaged on this carousel have come. It's very beloved by them.